Hi guys. Imagine this. You're walking down a dark cobblestone street in the heart of medieval Europe. The night air is heavy, damp with mist, the only light flickering from a tallow candle struggling against the wind. People in those times already lived with constant fear, plague, famine, war, and superstition. But there was something else lurking, something far more terrifying than the devil priests warned about in sermons. Men and women who walked among ordinary folk, who smiled, who traded at markets, who prayed in churches, yet by night they hunted, stalked, and killed. These weren't just criminals. These were the monsters of flesh and blood. The medieval serial killers whose stories still send a chill through the bones of history. And tonight, we're going to open their coffins and bring their darkness back to life. Dim the lights, settle in, because what you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Let us start our descent into the medieval underworld with one of the most terrifying figures ever whispered about, Gilles de Rais, a French nobleman, soldier, and companion in arms of Joan of Arc. If his name rings a faint bell, it's because history tried, for centuries, to bury the true horrors of his life. Picture this: a wealthy aristocrat, draped in velvet, a man who once rode with the Maid of Orleans, hailed as a war hero, celebrated in courts. Yet, behind the gilded walls of his castle, he committed atrocities so vile they would stain his family name forever. De Rais is said to have lured hundreds of children peasant boys, mostly into his chambers. He promised them food, shelter, or employment, but what awaited them was a nightmare. Contemporary accounts describe unspeakable acts, mutilation, ritualistic killings, sadistic pleasures indulged by a man who hid his monstrous appetite behind the mask of nobility. Witnesses later spoke of bodies burned in fireplaces, bones discarded like scraps, servants sworn to silence. It was not until his wealth dried up and his behavior became too strange to ignore that accusations piled high, enough for the church to intervene. His trial in 1440 revealed testimony so graphic that even hardened soldiers trembled. And when the judgment came, Gilles de Rais, once the celebrated knight, was executed by hanging and burning. Some historians argue he was a victim of political conspiracy. Others that he was indeed one of history's earliest documented serial killers. But in the medieval imagination, he became the embodiment of corrupted nobility, a wolf dressed in velvet sheep's clothing. But de Rais wasn't the only shadow lurking in medieval France. Another story, equally gruesome, belongs to thug Béram, though his tale belongs more to the Indian subcontinent. Still, while technically outside Europe, the medieval world was vast, and darkness was not bound by geography. Béram was one of the leaders of the Thuggee cult in India, a group infamous for strangling travelers as offerings to the goddess Kali. Records attribute to him the deaths of over 900 people during his lifetime. 900. Imagine the scale villagers gone missing, caravans swallowed by the night, families never returning home. Béram's method was chillingly systematic. With his gang, he would befriend travelers, join their company, and once trust was gained, he would strike with a ceremonial scarf, tightening it around the victim's neck with practiced efficiency. His confession, collected by colonial authorities centuries later, remains one of the most extensive testimonies of serial killing in world history. Still, let's circle back to Europe, because the medieval continent had its own plague of monsters. One of the names that echoes like a cursed whisper is Peter Stump, known infamously as the werewolf of Bedburg. Now, Stump's story dances between legend and history, but in the 16th century, he was accused of being a werewolf who devoured livestock, women, and children around the German countryside. The villagers claimed that Stump had made a pact with the devil, receiving a magical belt that transformed him into a wolf. By night, he prowled the forests, tearing apart victims with his teeth and claws. By day, he returned to his farm, a seemingly ordinary man. But when suspicion grew, authorities captured him, and, under torture, he confessed to a staggering number of murders, cannibalism, and incest. The execution was as brutal as the crimes. Stump was placed on a breaking wheel, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his head cut off, and his body burned. Whether he was truly guilty or merely a victim of hysteria, his name has been etched into history as one of medieval Europe's most terrifying killers. And here lies one of the chilling realities of the medieval era. Superstition and reality, often intertwined so tightly that it's difficult to separate fact from fear. Were these men truly supernatural beasts, or were they simply human monsters, cloaked in myth to make sense of their atrocities? Speaking of myth and reality blending, we cannot avoid the figure of Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian noblewoman, often dubbed the Blood Countess, though slightly later than the strict medieval timeline. Her legend is drenched in the same darkness. Bathory was accused of torturing and murdering hundreds of young girls, with tales claiming she bathed in their blood to preserve her beauty. Imagine the fortress of Lactus Castle, high on a Carpathian hill, where peasants whispered that screams echoed through the night. Servants allegedly helped her lure village girls inside with promises of work. Once within those stone walls, the girls vanished, their bodies found mutilated or never found at all. Though the blood-bathing legend may have been an exaggeration fueled by enemies eager to seize her lands, eventually Bathory was tried and walled inside her own castle, left to die in isolation. Whether fact or legend, her story fueled the archetype of the vampiric noblewoman, a figure feeding not on blood, but on power, cruelty, and the helplessness of the poor. Now, let's step back for a moment. What do all these figures, Zilda de Race, Peter Stump, Elizabeth Bathory, and others, tell us about the world they lived in? In medieval times, justice was brutal, faith was absolute, and fear of the unknown shaped daily existence. To survive, peasants needed explanations. When a child vanished, when bodies were found mutilated, when horrors spread through whispers, people sought answers. And often, the answers they clung to blurred human evil with supernatural terror. The killers themselves sometimes leaned into this, hiding behind myths of devils and werewolves, feeding on the fear that already gripped society. But among all the medieval killers, one name stands out like a scar across the centuries: the Harp brothers Mikaja and Wiley Harp, who terrorized the American frontier in the late 1700s. Now, you might think that's too late, but in spirit, their brutality resembled the lawless savagery of medieval brigands. They killed not for money, not for gain, but seemingly for the thrill of it. Witnesses described how they slaughtered entire families, even infants, without remorse. Their rampage was so horrifying that they became the stuff of early American folklore. And here's the unsettling part. When you line them up, from de Race to Bathory to the Harps, you realize that the medieval world was not simply about knights, castles, and chivalry. It was a world where, beneath the veneer of order, chaos roared. It was a world where ordinary men and women could turn into monsters, driven by greed, lust, madness, or pure cruelty. In the heart of England's medieval landscape, there was one case that terrified generations long after the events were said to have taken place. The story of Sonny Bean and his clan. Though some historians suspect embellishment or even fabrication, the tale spread across taverns, marketplaces, and manuscripts like wildfire. Sonny, according to the legend, was a Scottish man who, with his partner, retreated into a coastal cave. There, hidden from the law, they built a grotesque family of dozens of children and grandchildren born of incest. Their sustenance, the flesh of travelers, unfortunate enough to wander close. Ambushing at night, the clan killed, butchered, salted, and feasted on their victims. It is said that over the decades they murdered and devoured more than 1,000 souls, their cave walls coated in drying human remains. When discovery finally came, soldiers stormed the cavern and dragged the entire family out. What followed was a mass execution so ferocious it became legendary. Limbs hacked off, bodies burned, bloodlines extinguished. Whether Sonny Bean ever truly lived or was an exaggerated boogeyman invented to scare villagers, his name still represents the kind of primal terror medieval people associated with the wilderness, a reminder that even in Christendom's heart savagery lurked in hidden corners. Yet the line between myth and reality wasn't always so blurred. In France, during the late 14th century, whispers of a killer named Jean Grenier stirred panic. Grenier was a boy only 13, yet he claimed to be a werewolf who prowled the countryside, preying on young girls. He confessed that he had been given a wolfskin by the devil himself, granting him the ability to transform. Under this guise, he admitted to attacking children, tearing flesh with his teeth, and even eating their raw bodies. What made Grenier's case different was that he wasn't sentenced to death. Instead, the court ruled he was insane and locked him in a monastery for life. The idea that a child could be both predator and victim of supposed supernatural pacts shook the medieval imagination deeply. Villagers who already believed in witches, demons, and cursed animals now feared that evil could dwell in the heart of even the youngest among them. In Germany, during the late 15th century, another story etched itself into history, that of Peter Niers, a bandit and alleged mass murderer whose crimes spanned across decades. Niers was accused of killing more than 500 people, many of them pregnant women, whose fetuses he reportedly used in black magic rituals. His confessions under torture describe cannibalism, sorcery, and grotesque mutilations. Authorities claimed he could shapeshift into animals, disappearing into the night like a phantom. When he was finally caught in 1581, his execution was designed to mirror the magnitude of his crimes. For 3 days, his body was tortured, his flesh torn with hot pincers, before he was finally quartered and burned. Whether Niers truly committed all the murders attributed to him, or whether hysteria amplified his evil, his name became synonymous with diabolism itself, a living nightmare for medieval Europe's terrified citizens. But Europe wasn't alone in its horrors. Across the medieval Islamic world, another infamous figure emerges. Hassanai Sabahs, the leader of the Nizari Ismailis, remembered in Western chronicles as the Old Man of the Mountain. Though not a serial killer in the modern sense, his secretive order, the Assassins, struck terror across the Middle East. From their mountain strongholds, they dispatched devotees to kill political and religious leaders in broad daylight, often in crowded markets or even mosques. Their method wasn't brute slaughter of innocents, but precision murder, designed to send a chilling message. No one, not even kings or caliphs, was safe. These killings, while strategic, carried the same fear-inducing weight as the crimes of lone serial killers in Europe. Tales of fanatical youths drugged with hashish before missions gave rise to the word assassin itself. In the medieval psyche, the assassins blurred the line between holy war and murderous fanaticism, proof that terror could be wielded as a weapon sharper than any sword. Back in Eastern Europe, the legend of Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad III Dracula, stormed into folklore. Though hailed by many Romanians as a national hero for defending his land against the Ottoman Empire, his cruelty made him infamous across Europe. He was said to take sadistic pleasure in impaling thousands of his enemies, men, women, and children alike. Victims were seated on sharpened stakes, their bodies slowly sliding down under their own weight until death. A process that could take hours or even days. Chronicles from Saxon merchants and Ottoman envoys describe forests of impaled corpses, rotting in the sun, ravens circling overhead, a grotesque warning to any who might oppose him. While Vlad's actions were politically motivated, his sheer excess of cruelty placed him in the realm of sadistic killers. His legend fed into Bram Stoker's Dracula centuries later, ensuring his memory was forever bound to the image of blood, terror, and death. As we move west again, England gives us another tale steeped in both fact and myth. The legend of the Green Children of Woolpit and the suspicion of hidden killers. In the 12th century, 2 children with greenish skin appeared in Suffolk, speaking an unknown language. Though they were eventually integrated into the village, one child died, and the other claimed to come from a land of perpetual twilight. While this wasn't a story of a killer, its connection lies in how medieval communities often explained disappearances or deaths of children. They looked to outsiders, strangers, or supposed monsters. And when killers did emerge, bandits, outlaws, or sadists, the narrative of inhuman origin often cloaked them. Murderers were transformed into demons in human form, making them easier to fear, but also harder to understand. Now let's step into the shadowed streets of Renaissance Italy, where bandit Ezzelino da Romano carved his reputation not merely as a warlord, but as a sadistic butcher. He ruled parts of northern Italy with iron cruelty, and chronicles accused him of mass executions, burnings, and grotesque tortures. Entire towns suffered under his hand. Enemies were blinded, mutilated, or left to rot in dungeons. Though medieval politics often excused brutality as necessity, Ezzelino's cruelty was so legendary that Dante placed him in hell in his Inferno, forever remembered as a soul steeped in blood. His reputation illustrates how, in medieval thought, the line between warlord and serial killer was perilously thin. Power could become an excuse for killing sprees that would horrify even hardened soldiers. Consider also the chilling story of Christmann Jennepertinga, a German outlaw whose name remains obscure but whose alleged crimes are staggering. Arrested in the 16th century, he confessed to killing 964 people. His method: banditry on the roads, slaughtering travelers, sometimes torturing them for days before death. Whether the number was exaggerated by terrified chroniclers or not, the idea that one man could kill on such a scale without being caught for so long reveals the dangers of a world without modern policing. The medieval traveler lived with the constant dread that around the next bend of the road, death could be waiting in human form. In Russia, too, echoes of horror resound. Ivan the Terrible, though remembered as a czar rather than a hidden killer, indulged in acts that resembled serial sadism. He ordered the torture and slaughter of thousands during the Oprichnina, a reign of terror where noble families were annihilated, women abused, and cities burned. Accounts describe him personally partaking in torture, beating victims to death, or ordering grotesque executions for his amusement. Was Ivan a ruler gone mad, or was he a killer who found in power the perfect excuse to let his darkest instincts flourish? Medieval chroniclers leaned toward the latter, painting him as a man who reveled in blood. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, sagas spoke of berserkers who tore through villages in murderous frenzies, their killings celebrated as war feats but feared in peacetime. Among them, certain chieftains gained reputations not just as warriors but as men who killed for the thrill of it, unable to quench their bloodlust even after battle. Names have faded, but the archetype of the berserker turn-killer haunted Norse imagination, embodying the fear that even protectors could transform into predators. What unites all these figures, whether they were nobles like Scylla de Reyes, peasants like Peter Stump, or outlaws like Christmanez, that medieval society struggled to categorize them. There was no forensic science, no psychological profiles. Instead, people turned to religion, myth, and fear. Killers were labeled as werewolves, witches, demons, or devil's servants. Their executions were spectacles, not merely of justice, but of exorcism, purging society of what was believed to be inhuman corruption. Yet, disturbingly, some killers thrived precisely because they understood these fears. They cloaked themselves in piety, wealth, or legend. They weaponized superstition to avoid suspicion. And while their victims were silenced, their own names endured etched into history as warnings of what human beings are capable of when stripped of empathy and consumed by cruelty. In the crumbling corners of medieval Spain, another chilling tale emerged, one that has often been obscured by the grand narratives of Reconquista wars and royal struggles. It is the story of a nobleman known as Lope de Aguirre, a man whose obsession with power and delusions of grandeur led him into a spiral of bloodshed. Though technically remembered as a conquistador in the Americas, Aguirre's cruelty and sadism began in Spain, where his violent temper was already notorious. What makes him stand out is not simply the scale of his killings, but the eerie relish with which he committed them. Chroniclers describe how he would torture enemies slowly, watching their agony with cold fascination, and later in his life, when paranoia consumed him, he murdered even his own daughter to prevent her from falling into the hands of his enemies. While Aguirre's later rampages unfolded across the Atlantic, and imitators for Central Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries seemed almost fertile soil for noble sadism. In Transylvania and Hungary, whispers spread of minor lords who, emboldened by the countess's reputation, engaged in their own experiments of cruelty. Records often fragmented speak of nobles locking peasants in barns and setting them aflame, mutilating servants for disobedience, or hunting serfs as though they were game animals. While only fragments survive, they reveal a chilling pattern. Once cruelty became normalized by example, it spread. These lesser killers never achieved the infamy of Bathory, but their acts multiplied the suffering of the poor, ensuring that fear was confined to castles rumored to drip with blood. It was in every village that bent beneath a noble's will. Shift the focus northward to the dark forests of Scandinavia. One such tale is of Sten Sture's rivals in Sweden, men who turned political struggle into rivers of blood. Yet among them, individuals stand out for their obsession with personal vengeance lords, who arranged not the execution of one or two enemies, but the systematic slaughter of entire families, often carried out with ritualistic cruelty. The bloodbath of Stockholm in 1520, while political in cause, while kings ordered it, the zeal with which the executions were performed by certain henchmen revealed personalities that thrived not just in obedience, but in murder for murder's sake. In Germany, the shadows grow darker still. After Peter Neers, another name seared itself into the annals of terror: Christoph Hasemann. Though not a serial killer in the conventional sense, Hasemann-esque confessions of pacts with the devil and urges to kill reveal a disturbing glimpse into how the medieval mind perceived mental illness. Chroniclers wrote that Hasemann admitted to desiring blood sacrifices, to being tormented by visions commanding him to commit atrocities. He was eventually confined, his story preserved as a warning of diabolical influence. And here lies a chilling possibility. How many medieval killers were simply dismissed as possessed or mad? The infamous Borgia family has long been accused of using poison as a tool of elimination. While historians debate the scale, figures such as Lucretia Borgia were rumored rightly or wrongly to host banquets where guests drank wine laced with deadly substances, never to rise from the table again. Beyond myth, however, the Italian peninsula teemed with professional poisoners, often women. In the medieval imagination, poisoners were even more terrifying than open killers, for they turned trust food, drink, love into instruments of death. Crossing into the Slavic world, another monstrous tale surfaces: the legend of Domanik the Butcher, a Serbian outlaw whose name survives in fragmented folklore. Though the historical record is sparse, the folklore surrounding him presents the archetype of the sadistic outlaw, thriving in chaos, exploiting war-torn lands to indulge his cravings for death. The fact that peasants still whispered his name generations later testifies to the fear he inspired. Let's pause for a moment on the subject of outlaws, for they were the perfect breeding ground for medieval killers. Roads were dangerous, patrols rare, and in the forests and hills, bands of brigands thrived. Some killed only when necessary, but others seemed to revel in blood. Take the case of Martin Steyer, a German robber leader whose gang terrorized highways. His methods were vicious, not merely robbing, but torturing victims to extract hidden wealth, mutilating bodies, and leaving gruesome displays as warnings. When finally captured, the number of murders attributed to him was so high that his execution had to be staged as a public deterrent, a reminder that in the lawless stretches of the countryside, monsters wore human faces. Across the English Channel, tales of killers and cannibals intermingled. Beyond Sonny Bean's clan, other stories emerged in ballads and chronicles. In Yorkshire, peasants spoke of unnamed highwaymen who dismembered travelers, burying parts in shallow graves while feasting on what remained. These tales might blur folklore with fact, but they reveal a medieval paranoia that cannibalism was never far away, that desperation or worse, sadism, could turn neighbors into predators. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 deepened these fears. With food scarce, reports of cannibalism surfaced across Europe. In such a climate, when genuine killers struck, their deeds were easily magnified into legends of ogres and ghouls. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, the Hussite Wars gave birth to killers cloaked in religious justification. One commander, Jan Zika, is remembered as a hero, Yet his lieutenants sometimes engaged in atrocities beyond the scope of war. Chronicles accuse certain followers of burning villages, not for strategy, but for pleasure, killing peasants indiscriminately, indulging in rape and slaughter. Medieval chroniclers were often reluctant to separate war crimes from the acts of individuals. But within these armies, sadists thrived, men who, had they been born in peace, might have become lone killers, but in war found endless opportunities to indulge their instincts under the banner of holy cause. In France, whispers of child snatchers filled the air. Beyond Gilles race, who loomed as the great noble monster, countless minor killers preyed on the vulnerable. Urban centers, like Paris, were breeding grounds for vice, where children vanished and bodies were sometimes dredged from the Seine. While records often blame famine or abandonment, cases of sadistic killers are tucked into the margins. Execution records, naming men who abducted and strangled children, who confessed to multiple killings before the rope tightened around their necks. These nameless predators rarely became legends, but their victims were real. While some of these stories may have been Christian propaganda against the Ottomans, they reflect a broader truth. Killers often emerged from military ranks, men trained in violence, who, once untethered from discipline, turned their swords on innocents. War created killers. Peace could not always restrain them. Consider also the chilling specter of the Malleus Maleficarum, the witch hunter's manual that spread in the 15th century. While it was written to instruct in the pursuit of witches, its obsession with torture, mutilation, and death reveals something darker: the killers behind the judicial system itself. Inquisitors, driven by paranoia and zeal, executed thousands, often women, accused of witchcraft. Was this not serial killing under the cloak of law? The same inquisitor could oversee hundreds of deaths, each trial ending in burning flesh and choking smoke. And while society sanctified them as defenders of the faith, the glee with which some pursued their victims hints that personal cruelty was as much a motivator as religious duty. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. Medieval killers were not anomalies. They were woven into the very fabric of a brutal age. Nobles, outlaws, soldiers, clergio, capable of becoming predators. They thrived because systems of law were weak, because superstition masked their crimes, because fear itself became their ally. And when they were finally caught, their executions became theater. Public rituals designed to remind the crowd monsters had been purged, but only for now. Another always lurked. Across the blood-soaked pages of medieval chronicles, one figure continues to haunt the imagination: Bluebeard. Though largely remembered as a folk tale, the origins of Bluebeard may lie in real-life killers such as Gilles race or Breton lords, whispered to have slaughtered their wives behind locked doors. The tale tells of a wealthy man who married repeatedly, only for his wives to vanish. When his newest bride unlocked the forbidden chamber, she found the mutilated corpses of all the women who came before her. Though the story is moralized as a warning to women about disobedience, its resonance in medieval Europe reveals something deeper. People believed men like Bluebeard could and did exist, nobles who murdered in secret, hidden by their rank. Whether myth or truth, the archetype of the noble wife-killer stood as one of the age's most chilling reflections of domestic horror. From mythic France, we drift eastward to Poland, where records in court documents speak of Micha Pekarski, a mentally unstable man who attempted regicide in 1620 by attacking King Sigismund III with an axe. though his assault failed and Pekarsky was executed. Stories describe how in earlier years he had murdered servants and travelers, confessing to violent impulses he claimed were planted in his mind by the devil. His case sits on the boundary of madness and murder, but for contemporaries, he represented the terrifying possibility that divine punishment could twist an ordinary man into a vessel for slaughter. In Switzerland, tales of Hans spies surfaced, a soldier turned mercenary accused of killing dozens during campaigns and afterwards in civilian life. Chroniclers describe him as addicted to violence, a man who could not adjust to peace, who prowled villages for victims under the pretext of petty disputes or robberies. He eventually confessed to more than 60 murders before his execution. His story exposes a pattern repeated across Europe. War-bred killers and peace often failed to contain them. Further south in Italy, we find the chilling case of Matteo di Giovanfrancesco, a Florentine who lived in the 15th century, accused of murdering children for occult purposes. Matteo was said to drain their blood for rituals tied to alchemy, though historians debate the veracity of the charge given the period's obsession with witchcraft and heresy. The sheer horror of the accusations reveals how deeply people feared killers disguised as scholars or magicians. He was burned alive, his ashes scattered in the Arno, his name cursed in Florence's records. Whether guilty or not, he became a symbol of learned men turning knowledge into cruelty. In Eastern Europe, tales of Stepan Razin's predecessors circulated bandit chiefs who prowled the steppes long before Razin himself. Among them was a figure known as Ivan Isaev, remembered in fragmentary Cossack songs as a man who killed travelers for amusement, drowning prisoners in rivers, mutilating bodies, and decorating his camp with skulls. These figures blurred the line between folklore and fact, but they represented something undeniable. In the lawless expanse of steppe and forest, killers could rule as kings. Back in France, in the shadow of Paris, legal documents preserve the name of Perrin de Beauvais, a butcher accused in the 1400s of luring children into his shop, killing them, and disposing of their remains in barrels. Though little is known beyond the trial record, his story parallels that of later urban killers like Guillot de Race, suggesting a disturbing pattern: tradesmen using their profession as cover for bloodlust. For medieval city dwellers, such tales fueled paranoia that killers hid not in castles or forests, but in the very shops where they bought their bread and meat. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine Empire's twilight years, rumors swirled of monks who turned into predators. One particularly disturbing case in Thessaloniki records a monk accused of strangling several novices under the guise of spiritual discipline. When discovered, his order denounced him as possessed by Satan, and he was walled alive in his cell. This story, while obscured by centuries of retelling, highlights the darkest fear of medieval Christians, that even holy men could harbor the soul of a murderer. As we travel again to the German lands, we encounter Peter Stubb's imitators, men accused of lycanthropy in smaller towns. After Stubb's execution, hysteria spread, and multiple men were accused of transforming into wolves to kill children and livestock. Some confessed under torture to heinous murders, describing themselves as powerless against the devil's command. One case, in particular, in Ansbach, involved a supposed werewolf whose corpse was dressed in a wolfskin and paraded through town. The killer's identity remains uncertain, but the community's ritual humiliation of his body shows how seriously they believed human murderers could indeed be beasts in disguise. Italy again brings us to the figure of Hieronymus of Padua, a physician accused of using his position to poison patients. Unlike most killers, he targeted not strangers, but those who trusted him most. Over decades, rumors claimed he killed dozens, disguising murders as medical failures. When finally caught, he was executed not merely as a criminal, but as a betrayer of divine vocation. For medieval society, healers who turned into killers embodied the ultimate inversion of God's order, perverting mercy into cruelty. Traveling eastward to the Caucasus, local legends speak of mountain lords who abducted travelers, keeping them in dungeons until ransoms were paid, or worse, until their captors tired of them. In particular, tales of a figure known as Arslan the Cruel survive in Georgian folklore. Arslan reportedly murdered entire caravans, burning them alive or dismembering captives for spectacle. Whether embellished or not, such stories reflect the terror merchants faced along medieval trade routes, where killers could strike with impunity in isolated passes. In Russia, the story of Vasily the Skinner echoes faintly through chronicles. This man, said to be a tanner by trade, lured beggars and peasants to his workshop and flayed them alive. The skins were rumored to be sold under the guise of animal leather. While historians doubt the literal truth, the fear such tales inspired was real. It reflects the deep suspicion that certain professions, tanners, butchers, grave diggers, harbored opportunities for secret sadism. Medieval people, familiar with death in daily life, always feared those who seemed too comfortable in its company. Returning west, one cannot forget the blood-soaked stage of medieval Germany and Austria, where the case of the Bishop of Verdun shocked contemporaries, accused of orchestrating murders of rivals and drowning servants for amusement. This bishop embodied the nightmare of religious authority, cloaked in evil. His trial revealed a man whose sanctity was a mask for sadism, whose crimes were concealed by his rank until undeniable. For peasants, this confirmed their deepest fear, that even shepherds of the church could turn wolf. Across the sea in Ireland, sagas describe figures like Dubthach, Mac Ua, Lugair, a legendary killer remembered for massacring rivals in grotesque ways. While part of mythic tradition, his memory influenced the way later Irish people thought of local killers, men who combined cunning with cruelty, striking in ambush, then boasting of their kills in drunken halls. Such sagas blurred history and fiction, but they reveal how societies immortalized killers as archetypes, monsters whose names outlived their bones. In Spain, the case of Maria la Brava emerges, though she is remembered as a folk heroine. After her sons were killed, Maria took brutal vengeance, murdering not only their killers, but entire branches of their families. While she is praised in Salamanca for her courage, the scale of her killings veered into the territory of serial vengeance. The medieval mind excused her, cloaking her bloodlust in honor, but her acts remain chilling reminders of how easily justice could mask cruelty. Back to France, the records of the Parliament of Paris preserve multiple names of killers executed for serial crimes. One such man, Guillaume de Lisle, confessed to murdering 20 travelers over a decade, luring them with offers of lodging before slitting their throats. His execution drew massive crowds, proof of the fascination medieval people felt toward such predators. He was not cloaked in nobility or myth, but an ordinary man, perhaps the most terrifying kind of killer. For he revealed that evil needed no grandeur. And then we turn to one of the most terrifying unnamed figures, the child snatcher of Bologna, recorded only in brief court documents. This man was accused of abducting and killing more than 30 children in the 15th century. His motives unclear. His victims were found buried in shallow graves, their throats cut. When tried, he confessed without remorse, claiming the urge to kill was stronger than hunger. His execution was swift, but his name was stricken from records, as though officials hoped forgetting could erase his evil. Yet the horror lived on in rumor, whispered to warn children never to stray too far. Finally, as we close this gallery of medieval terror, we must remember that many killers were never caught, their names lost. Chronicles speak of bodies found in rivers, of travelers who vanished between towns, of bones uncovered in fields. Medieval Europe was a place of shadows, where justice was slow and killers could thrive for years. For every Shield de Race or Elizabeth Bathory who entered legend, dozens of nameless predators haunted their communities, remembered only in local fears. And so the medieval age, already plagued by famine, disease, and war, bore another curse, the curse of human monsters. They did not come with horns or fangs, though people imagined them that way. They came as neighbors, nobles, priests, soldiers, outlaws. They came smiling, cloaked in trust, until night revealed their hunger. Their stories remind us that evil is not a modern invention. It walked beside our ancestors, cast in the flicker of torchlight, staining castles, forests, and alleys with blood. These were the most notorious serial killers of medieval times. Not just names on parchment, but living nightmares, whose shadows stretch across centuries. And though the medieval world is gone, their darkness lingers, whispering in our folklore, haunting our tales, warning us that monsters are not made by myth, they are born of men. The Middle Ages were a time of chivalry, crusades, and castles silhouetted against the rising moon. But beneath the banners of kings and the songs of wandering minstrels lay shadows thick with blood. It was a world plagued not only by famine and plague, but also by predators who stalked humanity itself. Long before the concept of the serial killer had entered the vocabulary of scholars or courts, men and women roamed villages and cities, cloaked in the ordinary by day, only to emerge as monsters by night. Their names were whispered around hearth fires, recorded in chronicles with trembling hands, or preserved as cautionary tales meant to terrify children into obedience. Yet behind the rumors lay chilling truths. Human beings in the medieval world were capable of cruelty that rivals even the darkest chapters of modern history. One of the most infamous of these figures was Gilles de Rais, once celebrated as a hero, a nobleman who rode alongside Joan of Arc herself during France's desperate struggle against the English. Born into immense wealth and prestige, Gilles seemed destined for greatness, inheriting lands, castles, and honor. Yet behind the glitter of nobility lurked desires so twisted they would eventually earn him a place in infamy. After Joan of Arc was executed, Gilles withdrew from the battlefield into his estates, where witnesses later testified that he indulged in grotesque rituals. Children disappeared from villages near his lands. At first, peasants suspected bandits or wolves, but rumors swirled of a lord whose walls concealed unspeakable crimes. During his eventual trial, accounts poured forth describing how Gilles lured young boys into his castle with promises of food or positions, only to torture and kill them in chambers lit by flickering torches. Chroniclers wrote of rituals involving blood and fire, of a desperate search for forbidden knowledge, and of screams that were swallowed by the thick stone walls of his fortress. Whether every detail is true or colored by hysteria, the scale of the accusations was staggering. Hundreds of victims, countless families left shattered. When he was finally convicted, Gilles was executed by hanging and burning, his ashes scattered as if to erase his memory. Yet the memory lingered, and his name became synonymous with noble corruption and hidden monstrosity. But Gilles was not alone in casting terror across medieval lands. In Germany, tales of Peter Stubb spread like wildfire. Known as the werewolf of Bedburg, Stubb's crimes blurred the line between man and beast in an age already haunted by superstition. Villagers believed he could transform into a wolf, prowling fields and forests at dusk, ripping apart livestock and children with ravenous hunger. When he was eventually captured, his confession extracted under brutal torture ascribed a pact with the devil and an enchanted belt that allowed him to change shape. He admitted to killing and devouring men, women, and children, to incest, and to unspeakable crimes that shook the imagination of even hardened judges. Whether or not he truly believed he was a werewolf, his acts painted him as a predator driven by compulsions beyond reason. His execution was as gruesome as his crimes. Strapped to a wheel, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his limbs shattered, his head severed, and his remains burned. For the villagers, the ritual destruction of his body was necessary to rid the land of his evil spirit. The tale of Stubb echoed for centuries, becoming part of the folklore of werewolves. But beneath the myth lay the chilling fact of a man who slaughtered without mercy. The shadow of female killers also haunted medieval Europe, the most infamous being Elizabeth Bathory of Hungary. Known to history as the Blood Countess, she was accused of murdering hundreds of young servant girls in her castle. Though her case straddles the Renaissance, her legend grew from the same soil of medieval terror. According to witnesses, she lured girls with promises of work or education, only to subject them to brutal tortures within her fortress walls. Some accounts claim she bathed in their blood, seeking to preserve her youth. Though historians debate whether this detail was later added to magnify her horror. Still, testimonies described beatings, mutilations, and starvation, carried out by a woman of immense power who believed herself untouchable. When finally brought to trial, her noble status shielded her from execution, but she was walled alive in a chamber of her castle, left to die slowly in isolation. Her legacy became a grotesque fairy tale, a noblewoman turned monster, whose thirst for cruelty painted her name in crimson across history. Across Europe, killers stalked not only castles, but the very streets of towns. In Paris, the case of the child murderer Perrin de Beauvais terrified citizens. A butcher by trade, he used his profession as a mask, luring children into his shop under the pretense of work or food, then killing them behind closed doors. The same knives that carved meat from market became tools of slaughter. And when his crimes came to light, the horror of ordinary tools turned into weapons struck deep. His trial revealed the vulnerability of the poor, for his victims were mostly children of peasants and beggars, those least likely to be protected. His execution served as both punishment and spectacle, a grim reminder that killers could hide in plain sight, blending into the bustle of city life. Nor were such horrors confined to men. In England, legends tell of Lady Alice Keitler, an aristocrat accused not only of witchcraft but of murdering her husbands. 4 of her spouses died under suspicious circumstances, each leaving her richer than before. Locals whispered of poisoned drinks, cursed powders, and rituals conducted in the dead of night. When accusations mounted, she fled, leaving her maid and associates to face trial. Though the line between truth and witch hunt blurs, her story reveals how the medieval mind readily fused suspicion of murder with fear of the occult. The idea of a woman using sorcery to kill for power struck at the heart of medieval anxieties about gender, wealth, and control. Whether Hitler was guilty or not, the tale of the murderous noblewoman seeped into the folklore of Ireland and beyond. In Italy, too, the fear of killers mingled with dread of the supernatural. Matteo di Giovanfrancesco, a Florentine scholar, was accused of abducting children and using their blood for alchemical experiments. Though the evidence was tangled with hysteria, his trial records describe mutilated bodies discovered in cellars, and rumors claimed he sought to distill life itself from human sacrifice. Burned alive for his crimes, he became a cautionary tale of intellect corrupted into cruelty. His fate reinforced a recurring medieval theme that the pursuit of knowledge without piety could lead straight into the arms of the devil. Meanwhile, in the far north, sagas preserved tales of killers who cloaked themselves in the guise of warriors. Among them was Egil the Cruel, a figure remembered in Icelandic lore, said to have murdered entire families during blood feuds. Egil supposedly mutilated bodies to send messages of terror to rivals. Though sagas often exaggerated deeds to entertain, they nonetheless reflect a brutal truth. In lawless regions where family honor dictated survival, murder could spiral into slaughter, and men celebrated as heroes might also have been serial killers by another name. The medieval world also feared traveling predators who targeted those on pilgrimages or trade routes. The legend of the child snatcher of Bologna exemplifies this terror. According to chronicles, dozens of children vanished, their bodies later found buried in shallow graves outside the city. When the killer was captured, he confessed to murders committed for sheer compulsion, admitting that the urge to kill was stronger than hunger or thirst. Executed swiftly, his name was erased from official records, but parents passed down warnings for generations: never wander alone. For the shadows beyond the city held predators more dangerous than wolves. Even within the cloisters of religion, killers emerged. In Thessaloniki, records survive of a monk accused of strangling novices under the guise of discipline. His order declared him possessed by Satan, sealing him alive within his cell as punishment and exorcism in one. The story illustrates medieval fear of betrayal within sanctuaries, the horror that those sworn to protect souls might instead extinguish them. And so the Middle Ages, already a landscape of famine, war, and pestilence, became fertile ground for tales of bloodshed. Each killer, whether cloaked in nobility, hidden in trade, or disguised in religion, fed the same haunting truth that evil in human form could walk unrecognized among communities. Chronicles tried to preserve their names as warnings, while folklore reshaped them into monsters, werewolves, or witches. Yet the line between myth and reality mattered little to those who lived in fear, to the peasants whose children vanished, to the families who found mutilated bodies. The terror was real, and the shadows seemed endless. These stories, passed from tongue to parchment, ensured that the killers of the Middle Ages would not be forgotten, their legacy bleeding into history as warnings carved in fear. The terror of medieval killers was not confined to Europe's courts and castles, but extended into lonely roads, dense forests, and remote villages where justice rarely reached. Among the most chilling figures were wandering mercenaries, who found themselves unable to abandon violence after the end of wars. Some turned to robbery, yet others slipped into patterns of killing that seemed to serve no purpose but the satisfaction of bloodlust. Chroniclers in the German lands wrote of nameless soldiers who roamed after the Hussite wars, preying upon travelers, mutilating their victims, and leaving bodies displayed as grim warnings. These men became legends of fear, reminders that peace was fragile and predators lurked behind every tree line. In Spain, stories emerged of noblemen who used their estates not for protection but for cruelty. One such tale described Don Ramiro, who allegedly invited peasants into his hall for feasts, only to test their loyalty by subjecting them to deadly games. Though the records blur between myth and reality, his reputation grew into that of a sadist, cloaked in velvet and steel, a lord who believed his power placed him beyond divine law. His eventual downfall came not through the courts, but through rebellion, as his own vassals turned against him, storming his keep and dragging him into the same dungeon where countless victims had perished. Farther east, in the shadow of the Carpathians, stories told of shepherds who stalked isolated paths, abducting women and children and vanishing into the mountains. One, remembered as Dragomir the Silent, was said to have killed dozens, his crimes revealed only when bones were discovered in caves where he had taken refuge. Whether a lone predator or the invention of fearful villagers, the legend carried weight. 4 travelers began to avoid certain valleys long after his supposed death, convinced his spirit lingered to claim new prey. Even in bustling cities like London, killers found opportunities to strike. Records from the 13th century tell of a series of murders in which beggars were found with their throats slit along the Thames. Though the killer was never caught, rumors spread of a man who prowled the riverbanks at night, targeting the most vulnerable, whose deaths stirred little concern among authorities. His anonymity made him more terrifying than any noble monster, for he could be anyone: a fisherman, a merchant, a neighbor. For Londoners of the time, the thought that such evil could move unseen through crowded streets deepened the sense that darkness itself was alive. By the late Middle Ages, fear of such killers merged with folklore until communities could no longer separate fact from myth. Werewolves, witches, and demons became explanations for crimes too brutal to attribute to mere humanity. Yet behind every supernatural mask, there may have stood a real man or woman, flesh and blood, who killed with hands and knives, who thrived in the shadows cast by flickering torches. These figures, half remembered in chronicles, became the blood-stained shadows of the Middle Ages, reminders that monsters are often human, and that fear itself can outlive even the darkest of killers.